Morning, February 16th, 1945. An observation post above Breakwater Point on the south shore of Corregidor. Captain Akira Itagaki of the Imperial Japanese Navy has walked out with a small guard to watch landing craft assembling across the water at Marivilles. He commands every Japanese soldier and sailor on the island, and he is looking in exactly the direction he expects the attack to come from. Behind him and above him, transport aircraft are already in sight. Within the next few minutes, between 25 and 30 American paratroopers are going to land around that observation post entirely by accident, and none of them will know who he is. The American plan for Corregidor was built on a number that was wrong, put the Japanese garrison at 850 men. The Army's own official history later said that estimate had hardly risen to the level of an educated guess. The real figure was over 5,000. 2,050 American paratroopers were about to jump onto an island holding roughly 6 times the enemy anyone had planned for, onto 2 patches of open ground smaller than a city block. Nobody involved learned the true number until it was far too late to change anything about the operation. The unit was the 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team, built around the 503rd Infantry Jones, with the 462nd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and Company C of the 161st Airborne Engineer Battalion attached. Alongside them, the 3rd Battalion of the 34th Infantry Regiment would come ashore at Topside in landing craft. Together they were designated Rock Force. Over the next 11 days, they would count roughly 4,500 Japanese dead on an island 3.5 miles long. Rock Force lost over 1,000 men killed, wounded, injured, or missing. One of them received the Medal of Honor. Hit subscribe now, because the single event that broke the Japanese defense of Corregidor was not a plan, an attack, or a decision by anyone on either side. It was a mistake made by the wind, and it was finished before 9 o'clock in the morning on the first day. Don't go anywhere. To understand why 2,000 American paratroopers were ordered to jump onto a golf course, the story has to start 3 weeks earlier, with a colonel flying over the island in the back of a bomber, and then being told that the drop zone he had picked was not the one he was going to get. To understand the jump, the story has to go back to early February 1945, when Corregidor was not yet a military problem so much as an unfinished sentence. What was decided in those 2 weeks put the most difficult maneuver in modern warfare onto the smallest target anyone had attempted it against. It started with a promise made in 1942. It ended with planners accepting in writing that 1 man in 5 might be a casualty before anyone fired at him, and with the regimental commander privately estimating that the real figure could be 1 in 2. Corregidor is shaped like a tadpole lying in the mouth of Manila Bay, 3.5 miles from head to tail and 1.5 miles across at its widest. The head rises 500 feet straight out of the water. The Americans who garrisoned it before the war called the high ground Topside, the waste bottom side, and the slope between them middle side. In May 1942, it was the last organized American position in the Philippines to surrender. General Douglas MacArthur had left it by torpedo boat 2 months earlier and said he would return. Retaking it was partly a military question and openly a matter of sentiment. By February 1945, the island had stopped mattering to the Japanese command on Luzon. General Yamashita had pulled back into the northern mountains and written Corregidor off as an isolated outpost of no strategic significance to him. What remained there was the Manila Bay Entrance Force under Captain Akira Itagaki of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who reported to Admiral Iwabuchi in Manila. Itagaki had over 5,000 men, all but about 500 of them naval personnel, plus 3 Army Provisional Infantry companies and 2 provisional artillery batteries. He still had guns that could reach any ship entering the bay. American intelligence did not know any of this. Information about the garrison was so thin that 6th Army's estimate of 850 men was, in the words of the Army's own post-war history, hardly an educated guess. It was used anyway, because planning requires a number. That number is the entire reason a parachute assault looked cheaper than an amphibious one. Against 850 defenders, dropping 2,000 men onto the high ground promised to cost less than landing them on beaches that the guns on Topside could sweep. Against 5,000 the arithmetic was completely different, and nobody ever ran it. There was one genuinely suitable drop zone on Corregidor. Kindly Field, a pre-war landing strip on the tail, was badly overgrown but flat and open. Colonel George Jones flew an aerial reconnaissance over the island on February 6 and recommended it. General Walter Kruger overruled him almost immediately. A drop on the tail, Kruger judged, would not put the paratroopers onto the key ground quickly enough, and men coming down on that airstrip would be under the same plunging fire from Topside that an amphibious force would have to face. Jones was told to jump on Topside instead. On Topside, there were exactly two areas not covered by the ruins of the old American barracks, officers' quarters, headquarters buildings and gun batteries, 325 yards long and 250 yards wide. 350 yards wide, the other was a sloping golf course, and 185 yards wide. Both were cratered from 2 weeks of bombing, tangled with undergrowth and shattered trees, and both fell away sharply at the edges into cliffs. The planners chose them for one reason: if the Japanese considered parachutes at all, they would never believe anyone would try it there. The drop had to be flown as an arithmetic problem. Planners expected an easterly wind of 15 to 25 miles an hour. At the planned jump altitude of 400 feet, a man took about 25 seconds to reach the ground, and in that time the wind would carry him roughly 250 feet westward. That left under 100 yards of margin at either drop zone for human error or a single gust. A C-47 could be over the ground for 6 seconds, so each aircraft would drop a stick of 6 to 8 men, turn and come back for another pass. That meant the regiment could not be delivered as one mass. Putting the first 1,000 men onto Topside would take an hour or more. The C-47s would then fly back to Mindoro, reload and return, landing the second group some 5 hours after the first man jump. Every airborne officer involved knew this violated the founding principle of their own arm, which is to get maximum force on the ground in minimum time. There were not enough transport aircraft or parachute-qualified pilots in the theater to do it any other way, so it was going to be done the wrong way on purpose. Planners put in writing that they were prepared to accept a jump casualty rate of 20% before the paratroopers had fired a shot. Colonel Jones, who would be jumping with them, privately estimated the figure might reach 50%. To hold down losses on the beach, the amphibious assault was scheduled for 2 hours after the first parachute opened. The 3rd Battalion of the 34th Infantry would go in at Bottomside at 10:30, by which time Japanese attention was expected to be entirely occupied by whatever was happening on the high ground above them. Corregidor had been under air attack since January 22. By the morning of 13th Air Force aircraft had put roughly 3,125 tons of bombs onto an island of about 2 square miles. Naval bombardment began on February 13. On the 14th, Japanese gunners on Corregidor damaged a minesweeper so badly it later had to be scuttled and hit 2 destroyers. Admiral Burke's ships could not silence the island and were burning through ammunition trying. Admiral Kincaid sent 3 heavy cruisers and 5 destroyers south from Lingayen Gulf to add weight. Inside all of that, Itagaki made the decision that decided the battle, and he made it reasonably. He deployed against an amphibious attack. His strongest positions went to James Ravine on the north, Cheney Ravine on the west, Ramsey Ravine on the southeast, and Malinta Hill in the center, which are the 4 places a landing force would have to use. More than half his men were ready for action at those points. The rest he held in reserve on Malinta Hill and in the tunnels beneath it. The high ground at Topside itself he left thinly held because nothing was coming from there. There was a second problem inside his defense, and it was structural. Itagaki's ravine strongpoints had no communication with one another or with Malinta Hill. Every position ran a wire back to a single central switchboard on Topside, which meant his entire ability to command depended on one building sitting in the middle of the ground the Americans were about to land on. The pre-assault bombardment destroyed that communications center before the transports appeared. On the morning of February 16, Captain Itagaki commanded a strong, well-armed force that he could no longer talk to. That is where the first half of this story ends. Everything to this point is planning. What follows happened inside 11 days on 2 square miles of rock. At dawn on February 16, 3rd Board, C-45, the Pahada Patton 3rd Board, C-117th Troop Carrier Group, at Mindoro. The loading goes quickly and without incident. 7820 the eastern end of Corregidor as the transports come into view. The first man of the first lift is on the ground at 0833, 3 minutes behind schedule. Nobody fires at him. Nobody fires at the next several either. The lead aircraft release their sticks from 550 to 600 feet instead of the planned 400. The extra height means extra drift. The wind is over 20 miles an hour, 5 more than the figure then considered safe for parachute operations, and it is coming from further north than anyone predicted. Men who should be landing on a parade ground come down on the cliffs south and southwest of it. Others hit the narrow beaches at the foot of the bluffs. Jones and the troop carrier commander are circling overhead in a command aircraft on the radio, walking the following planes down to the right altitude. Among the men blown off the drop zone are between 25 and 30 paratroopers who go over the cliffs near Breakwater Point. They come down around a Japanese observation post. Fired on immediately, they assemble on the ground and attack it. In the skirmish, 8 Japanese are killed. One of them is Captain Akira Itagaki. The Americans who did it had no idea who he was, no orders to be anywhere near that ground, and had arrived there only because a crosswind put them there. Robert Ross Smith's official army history, Triumph in the Philippines, calls it one unexpected blessing of a scattered drop. With Itagaki dead and the communications center already destroyed, effective Japanese command on Corregidor simply stops existing. What had been a garrison of over 5,000 men in prepared positions becomes a set of isolated strongpoints, each fighting on its own account, unable to coordinate, reinforce, or concentrate anywhere. Nobody on the American side planned this, and nobody on the American side knew it had happened. Colonel Jones spent the rest of that day believing he faced an organized defense. The most decisive event in the battle for Corregidor was an accident, and it was over before 9 in the morning. Of the 2,050 men who dropped on February 16, jump casualties came to approximately 14%, 6 points below what the planners had been willing to accept. Roughly 210 men were injured on landing. About 20 were killed by Japanese fire or by hitting buildings. Another 50 were hit while still in their parachutes. At Bottomside, the 3rd Battalion of the 34th Infantry landed at 10:28, 2 minutes early, and held the top of Malinta Hill by 1100 at a cost of 2 men killed and 6 wounded. Every figure was better than the planning assumption. By dusk on the first day, the 503rd had a perimeter, the 34th had Malinta Hill, and combat casualties stood at roughly 55 wounded. Jones concluded the operation had gone better than anyone had a right to expect, and asked that the remaining drops be cancelled. The rest of the regiment came in by landing craft instead. What none of them understood yet was that surprise had bought them the first day, and nothing beyond it. Over 5,000 Japanese were still on that island, in caves and tunnels and concrete, and now not one of them could be told where to go. What follows is not maneuver. The island is too small and too broken for anything larger than a platoon to maneuver on, and the Japanese are static and disorganized, so the battle becomes several hundred separate small unit actions. A pattern develops fast. Aircraft or naval gunfire strike a position, and the infantry attacks as the last round lands. If that fails, the 503rd brings its own 75mm pack howitzers forward for direct fire. If that fails, assault teams go in behind grenades. If that fails, engineers seal the entrance, and the position is finished. One of the men doing that work has a name worth knowing before the numbers arrive. Private Lloyd G. MacArthur was a scout-o, born May 11, 1917, and he enlisted from Tacoma, Washington. His Medal of Honor citation covers February 16 to 19. On the first day, he crossed 30 yards of open ground under intense fire and silenced a machine gun with hand grenades at point-blank range. On the 18th, he accounted for 6 enemy marksmen. That night, when a large force tried to work around his company, he moved into the open on his own initiative and opened fire. It took a long time to get the details of this one right, because most accounts of Corregidor give you the jump and then stop. If this is the history you want more of, hit like. One like, nothing more. MacArthur's position was attacked repeatedly through the night. He crawled back to the American line again and again for ammunition. His submachine gun stopped working. That weapon became too hot to hold, so he discarded it and continued with an M1. At dawn, the enemy came again with renewed intensity. He stood upright in the open to locate the most dangerous positions and was seriously wounded doing it. By then, his citation credits him with more than 30 of the enemy. He refused evacuation until he had pointed those positions out for the counterattack. President Truman presented him the Medal of Honor on September 10, 1945. Here is what the 11 days cost. On February 17, over 300 Japanese were killed. On the 18th, nearly 775. On the 19th, a counterattack of roughly 400 men out of Cheney Ravine and Wheeler Point reached the barracks on Topside before it was driven back. That single morning cost nearly 500 Japanese killed against 30 Americans killed and 75 wounded, and the 503rd took the first 3 prisoners of the battle. Twice the island itself detonated. During the night of February 21, Japanese troops inside Malinta Hills set off the ammunition stored in the tunnels, apparently intending a controlled explosion to cover a breakout. It went out of hand. Fissures opened along the slopes, and 6 men of Company A, 34th Infantry, were buried by a landslide. Then, shortly after 1100 on February 26, the underground arsenal at Monkey Point went up. A medium tank was thrown 50 yards. Debris reached a destroyer 2,000 yards offshore, and there is an honest footnote the loudest version of this story leaves out. Corregidor is told as a triumph of the parachute assault, and the drop did not defeat the garrison. But the drop did not defeat. What defeated the garrison was that its commander was killed by accident in the first hour, and its telephone exchange had already been bombed flat, so 5,000 men never fought as 5,000 men. Rock force still cleared that island, cave by cave, for 11 days. The plan worked, not for the reason given. Here is the order it happened in. February Jones recommends Kindly Field and is overruled. Sun naval bombardment begins February 16 at 0833. The first paratrooper lands. Before 900, Itagaki is killed by men who were never supposed to be on that part of the island. February 19, the last large counterattack on Topside. February 26, Monkey Point. March 2, the operation is declared closed. You can stand on that ground today. Corregidor is a Philippine national shrine, and the ruined Topside barracks and the Malinta Tunnel are still there to walk through. Counted Japanese dead came to about 4,500, with 20 taken prisoner. An estimated 200 more died trying to swim to Bataan, and perhaps 500 were sealed in caves and tunnels. Rock force lost over 1,000 killed, wounded, injured, and missing. Private Lloyd Gilbert MacArthur was discharged from the Army in 1945. He died at home in St. Mary's, Idaho, on February 2, 1956, not long after his wife died of cancer. He was 38 years old. He is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery, in the town he was born in. On March 2, 1945, 3 years and 9 days after he had left it, MacArthur came back to Corregidor. Colonel George Jones stepped forward, saluted, and said 7 words. "Sir, I present to you Fortress Corregidor." Every plan for that island had been built on a number that was wrong by a factor of 6. Overground no airborne officer would have chosen. And the thing that actually broke the defense was a crosswind that put 30 men where nobody had sent them. Whether Kruger was right to overrule Jones is still argued, and it is worth arguing. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the Pacific, in any branch, on any ship, Leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did or said, or one thing you remember. A unit, a rank, a town they came home to, a job they went back to. The men who were there deserve more than a name in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.